Imagine the following scenario. A murder took place, and this results in a court case where the prosecution claims that a specific person called John committed the crime in question. What evidence is brought forth to support the claim that John is the culprit? One would expect that the evidence would be all about linking John to the crime, but suppose that the prosecution shows no such evidence. Instead, all the evidence is focused on the mere fact that the crime took place. They identify the victim. They demonstrate what wounds resulted in her death. They describe the crime scene. They demonstrate when the murder would have taken place. They identify the weapon, and so forth. In the end, there is no question about it. The specific crime in question has taken place. And from this fact, the prosecution concludes that John is the culprit. Would you agree that John can be convicted on the basis of this evidence? Now imagine the following case. The prosecution claims that John committed a specific murder. However, they cannot even demonstrate that a murder took place to begin with. There is no victim, no one is reported missing. There is no crime scene. In fact, the supposed culprit John is nowhere to be found. There's not even a record of him. In the first case, the mere evidence that a specific crime took place is simply insufficient to demonstrate that a specific culprit committed that crime. In the second case, the question of who the culprit is simply meaningless if the crime in question cannot even be demonstrated. It is certainly the case that demonstrating the crime is a prerequisite for identifying the culprit of that crime, but it is not sufficient. If someone makes the claim that culprit X committed the crime, the claim only becomes meaningful once the crime in question has been established. Once this is done, that's when you can begin to make your case for the guilt of a specific culprit. The reasoning behind this might seem apparent to anyone. It might be when it comes to court cases, but believers in the paranormal make similar mistakes. But let's take a few steps back first. It is usually a strange approach to define a term based on its negation. However, I found that believers in the paranormal fail to understand what I mean when I claim that I don't believe in the paranormal, or even make the claim that paranormal activity is epistemically impossible. The term epistemically impossible refers to anything that could not be real based on our current understanding of reality. This is different from metaphysical impossibility, which means that the entity or phenomenon in question could not be real regardless of what anyone believes about its possible existence. I would not be able to justify the latter, but I can justify the former. This is because in order for a concept to be potentially part of reality, it requires a meaningful definition. This is not to say that reality cannot contain entities or phenomena that we cannot recognize or even define when we encounter them, or which exist beyond what we can detect, even as far as the indefinite future is concerned. After all, we can define the concept of an unknown itself, even an unknown unknown or an unknowable unknown. But when we ask whether a specific concept is part of reality, something we can believe in, something we can experience in whatever way, even if it's just to a limited extent, we need to have a workable definition in order to recognize it when we might encounter it, or for it to serve as an explanation. If I say that I believe in global, but cannot even give a crude definition of what a global is, then I'm not even talking about anything in the first place. So what about the term paranormal? As I said, it is often not helpful to define a term by what it's not. But in this case, I think it can actually help to clear up some misunderstandings. In other words, when I say that the paranormal does not exist, what am I not saying? I am not making the claim that there are no unknown entities or phenomena. I do not claim to know everything, and I would expect that no believers in the paranormal would get that meaning when I say that the paranormal is not real. I am not saying that everything has already been discovered, or that everything can be explained by current knowledge. I would readily affirm that our current understanding of reality is insufficient to explain reality in full. In fact, I would expect anyone to affirm this. So if the term paranormal is merely a synonym for that which is not yet discovered, then I would in fact affirm that the paranormal exists, but that would make the term itself superfluous. And this is really what believers in the paranormal mean when they talk about paranormal phenomena. After all, the specific contents of my refrigerator are unknown to you and are currently inaccessible to you. Would you say that the contents of my refrigerator are paranormal? I doubt that you will. The term refers to more than currently unknown or currently without explanation. But in this case, I at least can check what the contents of my refrigerator are. So what about that which no one can yet explain? In cosmology, there is a problem of reconciling the theory of relativity with quantum theory. The force of gravity is not yet sufficiently understood to bridge this gap. Would you call gravity paranormal for this reason? I doubt that you will. Moreover, is this really in the same category of psychic readings, ghost encounters, or astral projection? Calling gravity paranormal merely because it's not sufficiently understood is not helpful, and I doubt that most, if any, believers in the paranormal would include gravity in the list of paranormal phenomena. Moreover, this would mean that any form of trickery of which you are unaware, or any new trick that a magician happens to come up with, would be an actual paranormal act. I suspect that paranormal believers would in fact make a distinction between paranormal activity and magic tricks of which you simply don't know how the trick is performed. So in order to speak meaningfully about paranormal claims, we need to differentiate between the following terms: preternatural and supernatural, and abnormal and paranormal. Consider the following phenomenon. Decades ago, a new light source was discovered in space. No known entity could be invoked to explain this. In fact, a new word was invented to label this entity: a pulsar. It was discovered that this light source is the spinning remnants of a neutron star. I doubt that many, if any, believers in the paranormal would label a pulsar a paranormal entity. This is simply a previously unknown natural entity. A label for yet unknown natural entities and phenomena is preternatural. Another example of preternatural entities would be alien life, biological life forms which originated in a different part of the universe. Strangely enough, aliens are sometimes labeled as paranormal, but this is inconsistent. Aliens are preternatural entities, hypothetical natural beings which are simply not yet discovered, or happen to be purely hypothetical and don't exist at all. Another example would be other universes in a hypothetical multiverse. The preternatural is something that becomes natural once it is discovered. By this I mean that the label changes. In other words, germs used to be preternatural in the past, but are natural since their discovery. However, would you say that if someone centuries ago hypothesized that microscopic biological organisms cause disease, and another person claimed that immaterial demons cause disease, that both persons were making paranormal claims? Or would you agree that there is a distinction between these two claims? Keep in mind that denial of the preternatural would be claiming that all natural entities and natural phenomena are already discovered. This is not what denial of the paranormal means or entails. That is not what I mean when I claim to not believe in the paranormal, or even that the paranormal does not exist. And I sincerely doubt that anyone else denying the paranormal uses that term as a synonym for the preternatural. So the term paranormal cannot be consistently used as a synonym for the unknown, the unexplained, or undiscovered natural phenomena or entities. Deniers of paranormal claims don't deny the unknown, the unexplained, or undiscovered natural phenomena and entities. And believers would not use the term paranormal for everything that happens to be yet unknown, unexplained, or an undiscovered part of the natural world. But the same applies to the abnormal or extraordinary. For example, take the fastest runner on Earth. This person has an ability that is close to unique. Very few people on the planet even come close to this ability. But is this what you mean by a paranormal ability? Could the fastest runner on Earth take James Randi's $1 million test? Just having an extraordinary ability is not the same as having a paranormal ability. Moreover, what is considered extraordinary is highly subjective. If paranormal claims are common in a specific group or in a specific society, then those claims would not be considered extraordinary. So now we have still not established what the term paranormal refers to, but at least we can establish what it is not. That is not sufficient, but at least it makes clear what deniers of the paranormal like myself are not denying. But it still doesn't really get us anywhere. So let's see if we can make a distinction between what is paranormal and what is not paranormal using two similar scenarios. Imagine the following. Your dead relative, before their passing, provided you with specific information. Let's just refer to this as info X. You talk about info X with a friend, and I happen to overhear that conversation without you knowing it. Several weeks later, I walk up to you and say, your dead relative told you about info X. You are shocked. As far as you could tell, there is no way that I could have known about info X. Your friend could not have told me, so you are shocked to learn that I know about info X. Now let's imagine a similar scenario. In this scenario, you never even mentioned info X to anyone. Instead, I have the ability to contact the ghost of your dead relative, and that is how I learn about info X. I am able to tell you about info X because the ghost of your dead relative told me. So here we have two similar scenarios, but there is an obvious difference. And I expect that both deniers of the paranormal and believers in the paranormal would agree that we are dealing here with a paranormal and a non-paranormal scenario. So which is which, and why label one as paranormal and not the other one? First, these two scenarios are similar in the following way. I possess information that you believe I should not be able to have. So where do these two scenarios differ? It is not the event, but the cause of the event that makes the distinction between paranormal and not paranormal. To be specific, it is the source from which I received info X. If I received the information from you, I suspect that we could agree that we are not dealing with anything paranormal, even though it is unknown or even unexplainable from your perspective how I've come to know about info X. The second scenario is paranormal because of the inclusion of a specific entity, namely the ghost of your dead relative. So we need to draw a very important conclusion here. Paranormal claims are not about phenomena or events, but about the cause behind phenomena or events. Me having knowledge of info X and it being unknown to you how I receive knowledge of info X is the event or phenomenon in question. That is in and of itself not paranormal. What makes it paranormal or not paranormal is what caused me to have that information. In other words, there are no paranormal events or paranormal phenomena, there are only paranormal causes or entities. Of course, you could choose to label an event caused by a paranormal entity a paranormal event, but that would only be so because a paranormal entity is involved, it being the cause of the event. It would still not be the event itself that is paranormal, but the entity behind it. So now let's return to the court case analogy. What would be required to establish a paranormal claim? In the court case analogy, the claim is that John committed a specific murder. The murder is the event. The supposed cause is John. Proving the event is not the same as proving that the supposed cause is in fact the cause of the event. You would need specific evidence for the involvement of that specific cause. Let's use this analogy to examine paranormal claims. Let's say you visit a medium and this medium provides you with information of a dead relative, and you can't imagine how the medium could know that information without being in contact with a dead relative. So you believe that this person has a paranormal ability, namely the ability to communicate with the ghost of your dead relative. So what would be required to establish that this claim is true? Evidence that this event took place, in other words that the medium was able to provide you with specific information, is not evidence for the paranormal claim. In the same way that proving that a murder took place is not evidence that a specific person committed that crime. Sure, it is a prerequisite, because if there was no murder, the claim doesn't even make sense. But it is nothing more than a prerequisite. It is not itself evidence for the claim. Providing evidence that an event that you believe to be caused by a paranormal entity took place is not evidence that the event was caused by a paranormal entity. You need to provide evidence for the involvement of that paranormal entity. If you cannot do that, the cause of the event simply remains unknown and we cannot reach a verdict. But I don't think that it's the case that we simply cannot reach any verdict at all. Let's delve a little bit deeper into what it would mean to provide evidence that a specific event had a paranormal cause. Most, if not all, supposed evidence for the paranormal can be reduced to evidence that a specific event took place of which it is claimed that the cause was paranormal. Not only would this merely provide the basic starting point for making a case for the paranormal, no such event has actually ever been established. This is what believers of the paranormal seem to misunderstand about the approach of skeptics towards their claims. For us skeptics, it is like you are saying, John committed a specific murder. And we are like, what murder are you talking about? You haven't even shown that a specific murder took place, let alone that John committed it. This is why challenges like James Randi's $1 million test exist. Under controlled conditions, the events claimed to be caused by something paranormal cannot even be established. But it is not the case that if someone could pass this test, that this would in itself be evidence for the paranormal. It would merely establish the event, which provides a starting point for further investigation, a basis for even asking what caused this event or phenomenon or ability or what have you. So let's suppose that someone would be able to provide information of dead relatives under controlled conditions. Someone would actually pass the test. How would we continue from there? One could try to find the cause of an event by either compiling a list of possible causes and eliminating candidates in order to leave only one possibility, or by providing direct evidence of a specific candidate, which may leave other possibilities open, but would establish this specific cause as the most likely explanation. The only attempts I have seen to provide evidence for paranormal causes are through the first method, and this method is not sufficient to provide evidence for a paranormal claim. So let me explain why that is. It is true that falsifying options is extremely helpful, but there are some things to consider here. You yourself may have used the process of elimination before during a multiple choice test. But the reason this can work is because the number of answers is fixed. If you can pick between A, B and C, and you can eliminate A and B, you know that the answer is C. But that is because the test is artificially set up that way. The same does not apply when examining how reality itself works, to examine what exists and what doesn't. Now you may object by saying that we only have two options, namely, the cause is either paranormal or it isn't. So if we can eliminate the option that it is not paranormal, we are left with a paranormal explanation. However, this is not a valid objection. First, there's the problem of the preternatural. In other words, we cannot eliminate all possible natural causes if we don't know what all possible natural causes are. At best, this approach leads us to conclude that no currently known explanation can be applied to the phenomenon in question. But as stated earlier, that is a nonsensical definition for the paranormal. This would lead us to apply the term paranormal to things that even believers in the paranormal would not apply the term to. The second problem is that in order to use the process of elimination, one must first establish that the list of options, even if you only compile a list of two options, really contain actual options in the first place. If I simply make up a random word with no meaning, such as global, and I say that it is one of the possible explanations for a given phenomenon, and if we eliminate all other options, we must conclude that a global is the cause, you would probably take issue with that approach. Given that paranormal causes are what's in question, we have not yet established that paranormal causes are actual options to begin with. I'll have more to say about that in a minute when examining the inductive approach. Another problem with using the process of elimination is that there is an obvious trap that you may be familiar with yourself. When taking a multiple choice test, or when trying to figure out the culprit in a detective novel, you may have noticed that the process of elimination is a quite fallible method. This is because you have to give a specific reason for why you eliminate a particular option. If this reason is flawed, like not taking into account additional information, or because of misinterpretation, or because of misunderstanding context, you may eliminate the right answer without realizing it. This may even include eliminating known and understood natural processes within a specific context and failing to recognize that the process may be applicable to this particular context as well. This is sort of similar to the preternatural, but instead is an extension of how known natural explanations may apply to other cases. And finally, you have to avoid arguing from ignorance. The most common attempt to account for a paranormal cause that I have encountered comes down to: I experienced X, I cannot think of an explanation, therefore the cause must be paranormal. Basically, it's sort of like shifting the burden of proof, saying if you cannot think of a natural explanation, it must be the work of a paranormal entity. In the court case analogy, this would be akin to saying, I cannot think of how anyone other than John could be the culprit, therefore John must be the culprit. You cannot convict a person on that basis. So the process of elimination is simply insufficient. So what about induction? Let's say we have an established phenomenon commonly attributed to the paranormal, like a person having information about your dead relatives. Now, in order to examine the cause, we need some sort of access to this cause. By this I mean that we need to expand our examination beyond the actual effect itself. Now, this may very well just start out with a mere idea, a concept. After all, in science you test an hypothesis, which is not literally just some random idea, but you need to start somewhere. But this is actually where we encounter the most fundamental problems with the concept of the paranormal. In order for something to serve as an explanation, it must be understood to some extent. If your supposed paranormal explanation is akin to just saying Glöbel did it, you are not offering a possible explanation to begin with. In other words, you need to provide a coherent description of what the entity is, a coherent description of what the entity is capable of, a way to distinguish this entity from any other entity, and a way to integrate it into our current understanding of other concepts it relates to. Now, these 4 points do not entail a complete understanding, which we don't even have of known entities, but if you don't even have some sort of rudimentary understanding of the hypothetical entity, you are literally not talking about anything. You would have nothing more than an empty label. It would just be like saying Glöbel. After all, you cannot explain a mystery with another mystery. An explanation explains by definition. And to be clear, even if the concept in question meets all 4 requirements, it still needs to be tested. Otherwise, it remains a mere hypothesis. So let's examine these 4 points in a bit more detail. If you believe that a medium gets his or her information from the ghost of the deceased relative, you at least have to have some understanding of what a ghost is supposed to be. You would need to give a coherent definition that contains no internal contradictions and/or badly defined terms, because that would imply that the definition really is no definition to begin with. But here we encounter the problem I dealt with before. We can define what the paranormal is not. It is not merely the unknown, the unexplained, the preternatural or the abnormal. At best it would merely be part of the definition, but not the complete definition. So, what is it then? I started off with what I personally do not mean when I say that the paranormal does not exist, or that I at least cannot believe that it exists. The only meaningful way, at least meaningful to make it a category on its own, rather than a superfluous synonym for things we cannot really doubt to begin with, like the unknown, the unexplained and the preternatural, and that is to make a distinction between the natural, the preternatural and the supernatural, with the paranormal being a synonym not for the natural or the preternatural, but a synonym for the supernatural. And this is what I understand the paranormal to mean: interactions with or abilities caused by immaterial entities, like how ghosts are supposed to be that which survives physical death, a non-physical mental being, and through whatever means such a being has contact with a medium as a link to the physical world. At least that would be the paranormal claim. However, this is still a way of defining an entity by what it is not, which is not sufficient. Whatever properties you ascribe to such an entity, it is already problematic to even define what it is that has those properties if it lacks material. Because how exactly is this different from ascribing properties to nothing at all? After all, supernatural means to be immaterial yet distinguishable from nothing. Otherwise, its non-existence would be included in the definition. So if you cannot make this distinction, you are either talking about the natural, whether known or preternatural, or the non-existent. This is why it's vital that this distinction can be coherently defined. You can of course claim that the supernatural is simply beyond our comprehension, but if that's the case, then it cannot serve as an explanation for anything to begin with. This is not a trivial problem that any believer in the paranormal can gloss over. If you believe in X without having any understanding of what X is supposed to be, in what sense do you even believe in X to begin with? What is this X that you claim to believe in? The second problem is the functioning of any supposed paranormal entity. You can claim that a ghost provides a medium with knowledge, but if you don't know how a ghost functions, you have no basis for claiming that a ghost is capable of producing this effect. If you have no understanding of what the abilities are of a supposed cause, you cannot know if that supposed cause can produce the effect that you ascribe to that cause. Even if something about our minds survives physical death, if it is in fact incapable of contacting the physical world or has no longer any information to share, then even if the medium in question provides you with special knowledge, the cause must be something other than a ghost, namely something that can produce this effect. And if you claim that a ghost can in fact produce this effect, you need to provide some understanding of how it produces this effect. Let's use the third point to really make clear why this is required. Paranormal claims are almost always not an appeal to just anything supernatural, but an appeal to a specific supernatural entity, like a ghost for example, and even a specific ghost. This means that in order to demonstrate the involvement of a ghost, you need evidence that specifically shows why a ghost rather than any other entity is the most likely cause. This means that even if you could demonstrate that the cause is supernatural, that would in and of itself be insufficient to demonstrate that a ghost is this specific supernatural entity. If the effect in question can be produced by other entities, then how do you show that the cause was a ghost rather than one of these other entities? To use the court case analogy again, merely showing that the victim was killed by a person is not sufficient to establish that John was this person. If you claim that the culprit was John specifically, you need evidence that it was John specifically, rather than someone else. The biggest problem to overcome here is the preternatural. Given what we know of the natural world, we have a basis for appealing to specific preternatural causes to explain supposed paranormal phenomena. We know that advanced technology can appear magical if you first encounter it. Biological beings from another planet much more advanced than us could have technology capable of incredible things. Or what about virtual reality simulation technology? If we encounter something beyond current natural understanding, we could at least in principle appeal to alien technology or a computer simulation hypothesis as genuine options for further investigation. Because these are things that we can define, at least to some extent, and for which we can provide a rudimentary account of how it could function and then find a way to test these hypotheses. Moreover, these would be natural entities, and therefore, at least in principle, something we could detect directly. The same does not apply to supposed non-physical entities. And finally, the fourth point. If the supposed explanation is in conflict with something else in our current knowledge, that would either shed doubt upon the supposed explanation, or it would have to account for this discrepancy. So what do I mean by that? Again, I will use ghosts as an example. As far as we can test, our consciousness requires a physical brain. Perception requires senses as well. Destroy the senses, or the parts of the brain that processes sensory information, and you no longer are able to perceive. This is demonstrable with any of the 5 senses. Memory is stored in the brain and can therefore be lost. Artificial memories can be made, and memories can be completely lost due to brain damage or diseases like Alzheimer. In other words, the evidence indicates that perception and memory require a physical brain. So if you claim that consciousness survives physical death, like the claim that near-death experiences occur when the person is actually deaf rather than near-death, or out-of-body experiences or a ghost contacting a medium, then this evidence contradicts that claim. In other words, if you want to support such a claim, your explanation needs to account for this discrepancy. You would need to explain, for example, why a person can lose sight or memory when alive, but suddenly regain it after death. Why are sensory organs required when alive, but not after death? I am not saying that you cannot go against our current understanding of reality, but I am saying that you cannot simply ignore it. Probably the most important point I can make is this: we need demonstrations, not assertions. Anyone can just simply make something up in an attempt to explain away contradictory evidence. This is known as an ad hoc fallacy or ad hoc hypothesis. You cannot merely reason paranormal causes into existence. Even if you would be successful in demonstrating the event of which you believe the cause was paranormal, even if you would be successful in making the concept meaningful and coherent, you would still have to make it testable and falsifiable, and then perform the test and have it examined and retested by others to remove personal biases, blind spots, or possible mistakes. If you are a believer in the paranormal, you may think that these are very strict criteria, but then I would challenge you to explain to me why I or anyone else should believe you if you cannot provide the evidence to support your claim. Why would I believe that John is the culprit if at best the prosecution can demonstrate that simply a murder took place and therefore someone must have done it and that they cannot think of any other culprit than John? More importantly, forget me or other skeptics, why would you hold on to your paranormal beliefs? If you think these criteria are too strict, please explain to me why they are and what criteria you would propose yourself and why your criteria would lead to a better understanding of reality. I am a materialist, but I'm also a skeptic. Even if someone would claim that a certain phenomenon was caused by a material entity, I would still require evidence for the phenomena as a prerequisite for that claim, and then evidence for the involvement of the specific entity. But when it comes to paranormal claims, you would need all of that and a demonstration that you are even providing a coherent option to begin with. Or, of course, the term paranormal is just meaningless gibberish like global, something that cannot be defined and is therefore indistinguishable from nothing, or it is a superfluous term for the unknown, the yet unexplained, or the preternatural. Even though these definitions do not actually match the paranormal claims that I have encountered to begin with. Therefore, I must conclude that the paranormal is non-existent, meaningless, or superfluous. The verdict has to be not guilty.